It's wonderful to see so many people in the room. Thank you all for coming. My name is Liliana Milkova, and I'm the Nolan Curator of Education and Academic Affairs at the Yale University Art Gallery. It is an enormous honor to introduce to you today our two distinguished speakers. Stephen Volk, who will share insights about art encounters as a pedagogic approach to teaching traumatic themes, and Jennifer Frederick, who will respond to his presentation and moderate the discussion afterwards. Jennifer Frederick is the Executive Director of the Yale Poorview Center for Teaching and Learning. An interdisciplinary and innovative thinker, scholar, and teacher, as well as a prolific author, Jenny has been transforming teaching and learning at Yale for more than 10 years, advancing both the university's commitment to teaching excellence and a national effort to transform undergraduate science teaching at higher education institutions across the United States. In addition, Jenny is the principal investigator on an award from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute to support a national STEM faculty development initiative. She holds a PhD in chemistry from Yale. Steve Volk is Professor of History Emeritus at Oberlin College, Ohio, where he taught for more than 30 years courses in Latin American history with particular emphases on the 20th century and the US-Mexico border and immigration. Steve has numerous publications to his name, and his research interests further encompass higher education pedagogies, museum studies, and object-based teaching and learning. At Oberlin, Steve founded the Center for Teaching, Innovation, and Excellence, which he directed until last year. In 2011, he was awarded the highest distinction for a college professor in this country, U.S. Outstanding Baccalaureate Colleges Professor of the Year. Steve holds a PhD in history from Columbia University. Over the last 10 years, Steve has been a profoundly inspiring colleague and close collaborator of mine. In fact, his approach to research, teaching, and learning has been transformative to my own growth as a teacher and scholar. And I cannot tell you enough how excited I am that he's here with us today and that I get to share him with Yale. His visit is made possible by the gallery's Martin A. Ryerson Lectureship Fund and the generous support of the Yale Poorview Center for Teaching and Learning. Please join me in warmly welcoming Steve.
Thank you so much, Liliana, and thank you, Liliana and Liz Harnett, for arranging this trip. I'm deeply honored to be here, to be given this stage. And for many of you who are teachers in the audience, you will know the kind of feeling that when someone you have worked closely with, collaborated with, has kind things to say about you, it means a lot. So thank you for inviting me. You probably all know that there's a variety of ways in which students can engage with collections, museums, galleries. There's a very direct way that is most commonly used. You can bring an art history course into the museum to look at the images, the objects from the period that you're studying. This, within the literature, it's often referred to as low-road transfer. It's kind of direct transfer of the information you get from one area into another. What I've been much more interested in are what we can call high-road transfers. When you bring a group of students studying physics in to look at a photograph by Harold Edgerton and try to understand the physics involved of the foot hitting the football at a particular angle. When you bring in chemistry students to an exhibit and help them understand the chemical changes in the pigments of the arts that are used in a painting that's 300 or 400 years old. These are high-road transfers because they connect learning in one domain with learning in another. And these are ways in which we begin to imagine the museum itself as an incredibly rich resource for literally every course that is taught in an institution of higher education. That's how I came to do a lot of museum work, treating many of my objects in a very oblique fashion to what they were positioned within the gallery to explain in the first place. And that's what I want to talk about today. At the heart of my talk is an attempt to disentangle two different themes that are presented both within this photograph and within the title of my talk. And how we can use museums to help us in that process. Both of these ideas, I think, are present within this notion of the execution of a Viet Cong prisoner, Eddie Adams' very iconic photograph from 1968. In itself, it is an image that may possibly trigger traumatic memories in some students. And while I will suggest that there is no way that we can know what in specific a student might respond to in a traumatic fashion, nevertheless, it requires that we proceed with deliberation, with consideration, with respect, and with understanding that images have an impact and they can have a very big impact. The second idea is that our work quite often requires that we engage students in topics that are difficult. They are complex, they are open, like this image, to many different readings. They contain fraught themes and can open contentious discussions. We know that many students and indeed many faculty may shy away from such discussions for a variety of reasons, largely because neither feel prepared to handle them or their consequences. And although separate, traumatic responses and difficult discussions, these two themes are most often conflated by media commentators, pundits of higher education, education critics. Indeed, this conflation underlies the portrayal of millennial and post-millennial students as snowflakes, young people who flee from any difficult discussion in search of safe spaces. There was a blizzard of snowflakes, for example, in Bill Maher's recent interview with the New York Times Magazine. Snowflake students, he said, are, quote, certainly more fragile than previous generations. Trigger warnings, safe spaces, crying rooms, microaggressions. That crowd, he said, feels like anything that upsets their tender sensibilities is completely out of line. What I'm complaining about, he continued, is fragility. What I'm complaining about is people who were overindulged as children and somehow believe that they should not have to endure even the slightest measure of discomfort. Well, to be sure, the turn towards a language of interiority with an emphasis on personal pain and feelings, which some students employ, can seem to foreground personal and psychological issues over structural causes, or as George Lipschitz, a professor of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz, once put it, the cultivation of sympathy over the creation of social justice. And further, as is often the case with stereotypes, and snowflake students is certainly a stereotype, there's a thread of reality to it, to which one must attend. Rather than dismissing it as fragility, a new study by Jean Twenge and her colleagues at San Diego State found that increased rates of major depressive episodes among young adults 18 to 25 increased 63% from 2009 to 2017, and serious psychological distress and suicide-related outcomes, suicidal ideation, plans, attempts, and death by suicide, increased by 71% from 2008 to 2017. These trends seem to impact younger adults above all and are not nearly as evident in adults over 26. In the 1980s, perhaps 1 in 10 college students could be readily characterized as needing or wanting or using some form of mental health treatment. That number is now 1 in 3, and the trend lines are rising. Addressing why this is the case is beyond the scope of this talk, but it's unquestionably true that there are many underlying causes to these troubling statistics. The country has been engaged in war continually throughout the entire lives of the entering generation of first-year students. Indeed, universities are enrolling growing numbers of veterans coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan. Our students have gone through grade school having had to practice repeated active shooter drills. Their phones, always present in their back pockets, are replete with photographic images of terrorist violence, gun mayhem, and drowned babies on riversides and beaches. For many, as a recent survey of 180,000 students, which follows up on a 2015 report disclosed, more than 1 in 4 undergraduate women experience a form of non-consensual sexual contact while enrolled in college, and most of them don't report it or seek out campus resources. Being aware of the stresses our students face is not pandering to fragile snowflakes whom we must protect from all harm, but rather to understanding that they bring the reality of their world with them into class. At the same time, and this is where the notion of trigger warnings as preparation for traumatic incidents is relatively useless, such awareness does not necessarily prepare us for how students may react to what we are teaching. It was brought home to me some years ago when I was talking with an old colleague who actually attended Oberlin College in the early 1970s. Her first year in Oberlin, she registered for a course in biology which required dissecting a fetal pig. Not really a problem. She and her partner cracked open the pig, and as she was examining it further, she went up to the head of the pig and came upon some whitish nodes, which she didn't know what they were. And so she asked the professor, and he said, "Oh, those are lymph nodes." And she ran out of the room crying hysterically. Turns out that her father had died of lymphatic cancer 2 weeks before she began classes at Oberlin. There was absolutely no way that her professor could know anything about this, nor know what the reaction would be. I experienced something quite similar when I was teaching a course some years ago on Chile, on a course I'll talk about in a little bit called Dirty Wars and Democracy. And I put up this photograph. It shows President Salvador Allende in late 1972. He went to the Soviet Union in the hopes of getting some aid for the country. And in the photograph, you'll see behind him his naval attaché, a man by the name of Colonel Arturo Araya. I explained that Colonel Araya would be assassinated by right-wing terrorists a few weeks after the photograph was taken. Class ended, the students left the classroom, and one of them stayed back. He was an oboist from the Oberlin Conservatory, and he was very shaken up. And I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "That was my grandfather." No way that anyone could know about this, could not see that coming. My critique of trigger warnings written into a syllabus as a means of addressing a potentially traumatizing incident is not that they aren't needed, but rather that they don't and can't do what they hope to do, since we don't always know, in fact, what will prove to be traumatizing. Still, if there's no way to prepare for what in fact can trigger traumatic responses, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be preparing for the discussions that need to be occurring in our classrooms, discussions that are quite likely to be difficult, challenging, uncomfortable, and perhaps triggering. And this is where we separate issues more related to student mental health from the fundamental question of how we prepare students to engage productively in difficult discussions. My experiences at Oberlin and elsewhere, experiences that I think mirror what I've come to hear from colleagues in many different institutions, is that students can be reluctant to engage in very difficult, complex, uncomfortable, uncertain classroom discussions, and that faculty often can be eager to avoid them as well. feeling wary or unprepared to handle what might develop in the conversations that ensue. Harvard Law's Ginny Sock expressed this a few years ago, writing that, quote, "Students seem more anxious about classroom discussions than they have ever been in my 8 years as a law professor. Some students have suggested that rape law should not be taught because of the potential to cause distress. Literature students at Carleton College told their women's studies professor that they wouldn't read Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye under any conditions." You probably have your own examples here. So how do we approach this reluctance? Since most of us would argue that our classroom discussions should be difficult, they should be complex and ambiguous, and perhaps uncomfortable and unsettling. To take from Elizabeth Barnes, a philosopher at the University of Virginia, quote, "It is literally our job to think and talk about difficult ideas. If we are unwilling to take on a measure of discomfort, given how much privilege we have and how little we have to lose, then I'm not sure we're using the privilege of an academic life the way we ought to." We also need to think continually and to continually insist that students cannot be passive bystanders to their learning. They may be spectators, to borrow from Jacques Rancière, writing in a different context. But as he stresses, being a spectator is not some passive condition that we should transform into activity. It is our normal situation. We also learn and teach, act and know as spectators who all the time link what we see to what we have seen and said, done, and dreamed. The notion of the active spectator informs Wendy Kozol, writing in Distant Wars Visible, of the idea of ethical spectatorship. Kozol uses this concept when exploring visual projects that foreground the inseparability of spectatorship and the ethical imperative to see in order to know about acts of violence and injustice. Our task, then, is to explore how a visit to the museum or gallery can help students see, and how ethical spectatorship can be transferred into the classroom to help us facilitate difficult discussions. So let me talk for a bit about my own experiences at Oberlin and how I came to begin to teach in a different way that helps prepare students for this. I have been teaching a course called Dirty Wars in Democracy for a number of years. It explores the descent into dictatorship in a number of Southern Cone countries in South America, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay in particular. I come on this theme with a history myself. I lived in Chile in 1972 and 1973. I experienced what it was like to live under the presidency of Salvador Allende, to witness the coup, to suffer the loss of many friends, and to finally leave many weeks after Pinochet took charge. And so for me, the course was more than simply retelling a history or analyzing a history. It was very much about something that I lived and something that I had very strong emotions about. And so I needed to come up with a way of dealing with this in a class. Within this, I also discovered that as we move from the period of civilian rule into dictatorship and into what became known as the Dirty Wars, there was a reason to prepare my students. And I found this in very hard ways when, in the midst of one discussion, after no preparation at all, a student ran out of the class, and I sent one of her colleagues to help talk to her, and later I talked to her myself. It became quite clear that something was needed for this. We're talking about countries such as Argentina, where an estimated 25,000 people disappeared during the course of these dirty wars, or in the case of Chile, where an estimated 40,000 people were tortured by the military government. So based on these reactions, I began to understand that preparing my students for what would come in the midst of this course was really necessary. And this was all before the trigger warnings controversy became a matter of public discussion. Based on my ongoing conversations with colleagues over in our art museum, the Allen Memorial Art Museum, I began to design an approach that could leverage the museum as a space to help locate my students, both literally as well as figuratively, in relation to the troubling concepts that we would soon be engaging in. In the weeks before I taught the course, I would arrange to meet my students before I taught the difficult issues of torture, disappearance, things like that. I would arrange to meet my students in the museum for a regular 75-minute class session. I had prepared with Liliana, who was the academic curator at the time, for that kind of visit. They were prepped on museum etiquette, asked to bring paper and a pencil, but told that they didn't have to prepare for the session in any other particular way. In the museum, my class of 40 students would split into two groups. One group would stay downstairs with me. The other group would walk up to the print study room where Liliana would take charge of them. And we would switch groups midway through. I would bring my students to a 16th century statue of Saint Sebastian, the work of an anonymous Italian sculptor. And they would spend about 15 to 20 minutes examining it and recording their changing emotions, their observations, how they thought about what it was that they were seeing. You'll notice probably that the arrows piercing St. Sebastian's body have fallen off over the years, as well as the binding that used to be present on his hands. They're no longer there. Now, I chose the work because it confronted the complexity of emotions that were present on St. Sebastian's face, but also because of its size and its placement, which was well away from the wall, which allowed the students to circulate around it, to walk completely around it. And as the students regarded the statue, I observed and photographed them, of course, with their permission. The process of observation seemed to follow a very similar spatial pattern every time that I presented it to them, to the students in different classes over many different years. Starting from where they first found themselves in the gallery, they then gradually approached the statue, drawing progressively closer. Until, in general, they finally pulled away again and ultimately found a place to locate themselves from which they spent the next 15 minutes or so observing the statue until the time was up. Meanwhile, up in the print study room, the second group worked with a small set of photographs that almost always included Nan Golden's harrowing Nan 1 month after being battered. That photograph, which is printed on highly glossy paper, is placed on a table, and as the students drew close to examine it, they often could see their own reflection superimposed on the image. Inevitably, and unlike the viewing of St. Sebastian, it produced what Jill Bennett describes as squirm, the moment of seeing, feeling that provokes embodied responses to visual representation. At the end, we would gather for a very brief discussion in the gallery itself, in the museum. The reactions to Nan Golden's photograph almost always elicited more comment than that of the Sebastian statue, and is more likely to produce a kind of empathetic reaction, empathetic vision. But many of the comments on St. Sebastian concerned how their emotional reactions, how their emotional observations changed over the course of the 15 to 20 minutes of observation. We continued discussing the visit once back in the classroom at the next session, and it's at that point that I discuss my purpose in bringing them to the museum in the first place. As I said, while they observed the artifacts, I observed them and their physical relationship to the object that they were studying, their interactions with it, how they drew close, how they pulled away, how they ultimately found a spot in which to situate themselves. I first began to think of the importance of physical space and embodiment in learning in relation to trauma and identity when watching a documentary by Sebastián Moreno, a Chilean filmmaker. His documentary, La Ciudad de los Fotógrafos, reports on the photographers and the journalists who were covering the demonstrations against Pinochet that broke out beginning in 1982. They talked to him about their difficulty inherent in the work that they were doing, not just the fact that they would risk their lives to get the images or stories they wanted, but also the contradictions that were involved in their work itself. They found themselves wanting demonstrations to break out so they would have something to record, something to report on, even though they knew those demonstrations would produce the military responses and the death of the demonstrators. Ultimately, being so close to their subjects, they felt that they were becoming those that they reported on. This predictably led me to study war photographers who found themselves in the same situation. A dilemma for such war photographers who lose sight of the horror and inhumanity of their environment, Susan Moeller writes in Shooting War, Photography and the American Experience of Combat, is that they also lose their ability to distinguish sanity from insanity, kindness from brutality. Without an outraged perspective, without the belief that the world is mad, war seems normal. In the same vein, combat journalist Michael Herr wrote of the photographer who, quote, after 3 years in the field, turned into the thing he came to photograph. The question then posed was how to introduce the notion of an ethical spectatorship into the viewing that could help students think about what they were seeing and open up conversations without becoming what they were viewing. It seemed to me that the issue which kept coming up for them was, where do you stand? Where do you place yourself when thinking about images or stories of trauma, abuse, war, and destruction? Susan Meiselas, who photographed wars in Nicaragua and El Salvador, described this from a different perspective. She argued that after taking photographs of the Nicaraguan Revolution in 1979, her agency sent her a 400 millimeter lens because they felt she was getting too close to her subjects. She used it for about a week and then discarded it, arguing that I want to be close to what's happening. When my lips go dry, Larry Burroughs wrote, and my stomach turns over, I feel, should I be doing this? But then I feel, if I don't, what am I missing? There is always this urge to have a look and see what's happening to my left, to my right, further forward. I can't resist it. Burroughs covered the Vietnam War for Life magazine from 1962 until 1971, when the helicopter that was traveling in over Laos was shot down and he was killed. Location for Burroughs, for Meiselas, was critical. The same issue was raised in an otherwise really problematic speech by Karl Ove Knausgaard, which later appeared in The New Yorker. He wrote of, quote, a vanishing point in our humanity, a point at which the other goes from being definite to indefinite. But this point, he continued, is also the locus for the opposite movement, in which the other goes from indefinite to definite. He described this point as the zone that lies between the one and the all, as the place where the ethics of the novel rests. It's presumptuous for me to say, but in some ways I have found that space in the context of teaching and learning to be where the ethics of viewership is located. And I was able to get there only by putting students in a context where bodily placement, where they had to think about themselves as an embodiment, was important, where I could talk quite concretely about where they stood as they viewed the object which they were either finding straightforward or difficult. If we place ourselves too close to our subject, we face the danger of figuratively merging into it, either becoming the torturer's victim or, worse yet, the torturer, of becoming Nan 1 month after being battered, of turning into, to paraphrase Michael Herr, what we have come to study. If we place ourselves too far away, we will not be able to appreciate the individuality of the subjects we are about to encounter in our studies. We will only see 25,000 disappeared in Argentina or 40,000 tortured in Chile, and we will fail to recognize that these events for the victims took place one by one as individuals. And this is why Mycellus refused the 400mm lens. The museum can help our students deal with witnessing as a transitive process, helping them select the proper lens, warning them of the problems of the 21mm lens close-up, as well as the limitations of viewing from a 400mm perspective. Our task is to help them be aware of where they will place themselves in relation to what they are witnessing. We are faced, as I've been arguing, with a number of choices when deciding whether to bring our students to such difficult subjects as that represented in Eddie Adams' still shocking photograph. We can refuse to teach them, either fearing their potentially traumatic or traumatizing impact on students or acquiescing to their demands that such matters not be broached. That, I would suggest, is unacceptable. Namwali Serpell, in a recent article, cites Hannah Arendt's insistence on making present to my mind the standpoints of those who are absent. Arendt argues that the political function of the storyteller, and here I think of us as instructors as storytellers, is to teach acceptance of things as they are. Out of this acceptance, which can also be called truthfulness, arises the faculty of judgment. Serpell clarifies that Arendt does not mean acceptance as a form of political quietism. She means truthfulness as opposed to propaganda, which is partial, biased, incomplete information. Truthfulness comes from greater or more representation, not from avoiding topics, and art can be used to concretize these issues for transfer back into our classrooms. We could also ignore all this and simply plow ahead with our lesson plans. We can put trigger warnings, much as the BBC News article on the website where this photograph appears, by proclaiming, warning, the story includes Adam's photo of the moment of the shooting and graphic descriptions of it. Or we can prepare students for the experience and use of using the museum as the most appropriate device for this kind of preparation. So let me close by suggesting and summarize some of the main points for why museums can be important as a means of facilitating discussions as they are needed. The first point is that if it is serious, take it seriously. Spending time to prepare students is not extraneous, unnecessary, or wasted time. It indicates to our students how seriously we take, and therefore they must take, the emotional impact of the materials they will be studying. And it does it in a way that trigger warnings placed on a syllabus or spoken before a reading simply can't. A trip to the museum or the gallery suggests a break in the regular order of things, not a break from learning, but a desire to learn in a particularly significant fashion. Designing these kinds of exercises underscores an understanding that learning involves not just reading a book or listening to a lecture, but the very process of preparing for learning. And this requires that we give them the tools that not only aid their cognitive capacities, but their emotional capacities, their emotional intelligence as well. As I've suggested, taking the time to bring students to the art gallery indicates the importance of the subject to be learned. It can also show how learning is embodied, that you actually learn differently when standing up than when sitting down. I spoke about this at a teaching demonstration yesterday. What I found by doing this over the years is that students who often are quite quiet in a classroom setting, sitting down, when placed in a gallery moving around, are the ones who talk the most. That the actual nature, the physical nature of the body can be involved in learning, and by getting students out of their chairs and into a different context, you will find things about your students that you never actually knew. More than ever, learning requires that we slow down and that we concentrate. You probably know, but I will stress how incredibly difficult it is to hold students before an object for 15 to 20 minutes and ask them to observe it. I am always amazed when I think of the experiment that Jennifer Roberts at Harvard engaged in when she required her students in class to observe a John Singleton Copley's A Boy with a Flying Squirrel for 3 hours, just watching that. Close observation can be central to a process of deceleration, which will lead to questions that can only be approached by looking at further context and opening up further study. This image itself, the Eddie Adams image, demands context, but it's also produced a very thick historical narrative that can lead us in a myriad of directions. The history of war, the nature of the fighting, the relationship between the photographer and the subjects, the further history of the executioner in history, what was going on and what the past was, or what the future relationships were between Eddie Adams and the general in this case. More than ever, when we face an all-out attack on factuality, indeed on perceptual reality, our task of helping our students root their analysis and sustain their arguments in an evidentiary basis is all the more important. The observation of material cultural objects, particularly when paired with a visual strategy approach such as VTS, visual thinking strategy, is a powerful way to help students be aware of evidence. What do you see? The relationship of evidence to argument. What's going on? What makes you say that? In many, many occasions where I followed faculty that have used the museum back to their classrooms, the ability to have students link argument to evidence made concrete within, well, when you were in the museum, you pointed out precisely on that object what made you make that argument. It's very powerful. So it's a way, again, this is high road transfer when one kind of domain influences another. At the same time, witnessing or seeing is itself subject to ambiguity that necessitates further discussion, exchange, and collaboration. Tamar Ashuri and Amit Pinchevetsky have argued that media witnessing, quote, is a field in which various forces, resources, and agents compete. Witnessing is to be regarded as subject to contest and struggle. What is learned by visual witnessing and discussion in the museum not only opens the door to immediate feedback, but can open the door to continued and iterative discussion when back in the class. Finally, Serpell talks of Bertolt Brecht's theory of political art, which was contrasted to Aristotle's notion of drama as catharsis of emotion, which would move us to pity and fear, to free us from such dangerous feelings when we left the theater. Brecht, she argued, wants us to leave the theater ready to start a riot. Art, Brecht would argue, should not be a release valve, but a combustion engine. Art can help us turn learning into a combustion engine if that is what we allow it to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. These are on, right? Yes? Okay, great. So I'll explain briefly the structure of the rest of our time together so you know what to expect. And first, I'll make just a few comments, particularly from a pedagogical angle. And I have a few questions for you, Steve. And then we'll invite you to join the conversation. So please be thinking of your questions and the things that you want to say about what we've just heard together. Steve, we often hear these days that our country is in a divided time, and I think this is not the first time that this has been true. This is not the only place in the world for which this is true, and it won't be the last time for sure. So I particularly appreciate how you helped us experience in the teaching demonstration yesterday and then also today how to use art as a productive entryway for conversation. And I think in particular that a big goal of higher education is to help students connect and have conversations about really challenging issues and to have conversations across significant differences, whether those are differences in background, in points of view, in all kinds of ways. So yesterday, I'll just comment on experiencing that in the gallery with you was really powerful, standing right next to the same work of art, literally inches away from someone else, and seeing different things by looking at the same object that really brought it to life. It was uncomfortable, and it was not threatening. So I thought that was a really fascinating combination. So I would love to ask you a little bit more about this idea of ethical spectatorship. And yesterday in the gallery was different than looking at a big screen today. So could you say a little more about how, I wrote down a quotation that you said yesterday about this is why we need to go to museums. This is why we need to take our students to look at actual objects. And when does that break down? Can you preserve ethical spectatorship, and can you foster that by looking at pictures in books, by looking at pictures on the screen? What's your experience with that?
It's a good question, and behind the question is, what if you don't have a rich gallery such as Yale or a wonderful museum such as Oberlin? What do you do? So part of my answer to that is that while visits to collections of material culture can be particularly useful, most people will live in communities that have some kind of art resource, but all live in communities that have physical objects. And the physical objects don't have to be in a classroom, in a museum or a gallery for them to be of importance. Part of the process that I found really important about using the museum, and this sometimes museum curators are a little upset about, is that it's almost beside the point what's in there. Part of it is a signaling process that something different will be happening. Students can be used to field trips as a way for the teacher, for the instructor to sort of put him or herself aside, turn them over to someone else and let some other extraneous process happen. What I'm always concerned of is having the instructor there to be part of the learning process as well. And so that by literally crossing the street, by going out of the classroom, by getting on a shuttle bus and going to West Campus, by all of those things you say to your students, something else will happen. And that is also the case if you simply walk outside and explore your neighborhood and explore what's there. The second aspect about that, which I've stressed here and yesterday, is really the embodiment. We are physical beings, and placing students in chairs doesn't often or always help understand that. And so those are also opportunities that you have when you leave the classroom. Actually, one of the things that I had a harder time dealing with yesterday in the teaching demonstration, and of course it was hard because I only use these issues in class with lots of preparation ahead of time, a preparation for the visit or not, but lots of follow-up afterwards, and so it doesn't always lend itself. And I always use a three-dimensional figure that they can walk around, and because that, to me, really gets at this notion of distance and helps me explain through the notion of physicality that if you turn that into figurative language, that you have to be aware of where you are always. So we will be reading in this course accounts of people who suffered from torture, or in one case of people who were the torturer themselves. And being able to place yourself, to actually locate yourself in neither point of torture or tortured becomes very important. So any of those opportunities where you could use physicality, those also help. So there's ways in which, even if you don't have these rich resources, you can make use of them.
And thank you for reading the question in my question. I also want to bring forward another part of yesterday's teaching demonstration and ask you to almost repeat the comment that you made, or the observation, is about how we all become novices when we're confronted by a new material object or piece of art. Could you say something about how that influences the instructor-student dynamic?
Sure. So I became aware of this when it was before Liliana's time at the Allen, and I was invited to give a gallery talk on a painting by Diego Rivera, which was in part of our collection. And I teach courses on the Mexican Revolution. I know it well. I had no problem saying, yeah, of course, I'd be happy to do that. And I realized as I prepared for the presentation, I was scared out of my wits. I had taught there for probably 20 years at that time. And yet, I was going to be talking to a room filled with art historians and curators at the museum, and I'm not an art historian. I couldn't tell you much about Rivera's artistic content in that sense. I know about the period of time. And I realized that I became a novice within that context. I was an expert in that I know an awful lot about the Mexican Revolution, and I was a novice in the context of art history. And that feeling that I had, I realized, is the feeling that all of our students have when they engage in subjects that they don't know, which is every subject that they go into class. That's what they feel when they get into calculus. That's what they feel when they get into a course on Shakespeare. They're all novices, and we have long ago forgotten what the questions are that they ask that helps them get over that first hurdle, because we passed over that hurdle years ago. And so by returning yourself to novice status, you suddenly become aware that there's different kinds of questions that could be posed. So by insisting within the faculty visits to an art museum or gallery, that the faculty always be there with the students and never just hand over their class to the curator, and that the faculty become part of that learning process itself, then you are putting people at a relatively similar level within that. And that, I think, both changes the dynamic of the class and changes your own thinking about where you are in that process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So your focus is understandably undergraduates and college-age students. Could you talk a little bit about how this approach would transfer to, say, graduate students or community groups, or even particularly younger students who might have a different socialization or level of maturity in response to some of the images and the materials?
Well, again, one of the great things about using material culture, art in particular, is that it doesn't matter how old you are in that sense. So you can be 5 years old and you can be 75 years old. You're looking at the same object. And for anyone who has taken visitors around a gallery, you realize that the kinds of questions, the kinds of responses that will be elicited by the visitors that you have depend fundamentally on how old they are, what their experiences are. And that's wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful, which you can't get by reading almost all texts. They will already decide what age you need to be to read them. But by visual culture, you get responses from 8-year-olds that open up ways of looking at things that you just have forgotten about because you're no longer 8 yourself. And so art then provides that kind of mechanism. And then what you can do with that, to present an 8-year-old perspective to a graduate student, it doesn't work the other way around. is amazing, because you realize the layers on layers. You realize how we're conditioned to look at things, which if you're not conditioned in that way, it's one of the reasons, I've said this before, why I particularly enjoy teaching undergraduates as opposed to graduate students who are not kind of embedded in their disciplinary training so fully that they could ask questions that graduate students probably don't think of anymore because they know that question's out of bounds. So the any kind of visual culture works in that way because it allows everyone access to it.
Yeah. So that question might be a good opportunity for us to turn it around. I imagine that there are people here who are instructors, students, part of the community, museum experts, and you may also have experiences and perspectives. What have you done to bring images and objects into your classrooms? What questions do you have from that experience for Steve? And we'll circulate a microphone so that we can hear your questions or your comments on your experiences.
Thank you. Kind of jumping off of your point about age, is there a way that you approach a class when you know that you have students from very different backgrounds, but they're all in the same class level? So let's say students who are first generation, low income, and there are other students who are coming from college preparatory schools and have a very different understanding of art history, and they're walking into a gallery, they've seen it before. So are there techniques or strategies that you employ for that discussion, and kind of what would that look like?
I think that depends. It's a lot dependent on the class that you're teaching and exactly what you're getting at. Probably more of an issue is the questions of diversity and inclusion when you have a very, say, racially diverse class, and the material that you're looking at will bring up lived experiences that are different in some of the viewers than in others. Preparing for, again, just to use the same words I use, that kind of ethical spectatorship, the respect that's demanded out of different viewings, that becomes important. I haven't found the issue of background or preparation. Some students who are first gen versus, families that have been educated in colleges for a long time. That never seems to be an issue, but the diversity of the viewership and what they bring to it and how you then open that space, often not in the gallery itself, because often you don't have time in the gallery to explore it, but indicating that those kinds of responses will be welcomed back in the class, and then how do you set the groundwork for different experiences to come out and be listened to and treated in respectful ways. That becomes quite an important thing, much more important than levels of preparation.
So continuing on with that thought, in the classes afterwards, do you ever model the kind of vulnerability that some of the students have to engage in dealing with some of these images? Do you ever open up about like your experiences in Chile, and so you are likely to have a strong emotional reaction to those images, but maybe not the ones from Argentina so much? So do you kind of model that?
Yes. So some of these questions came up in the teaching demonstration, and some came up at dinner last night, and I'll explain some of the things. But why this particular class of Dirty Wars and Democracy became a kind of model for my thinking about, in general, how to deal with the topics is because it was virtually impossible for me to separate the emotional from the intellectual. It was my lived experience. I had attempted to deal with it for probably about 10 years by not teaching it at all, largely because it was just too painful. And then I thought, I can't present this in a certain way as sterile and unemotional, it just wouldn't work. It wasn't who I was, and it wasn't what I felt was necessary about teaching. So I'm left with this kind of dilemma of, the normal view of us as instructors is that we leave our emotions at the door, and that we are much more into the cognitive. Besides the fact that there's an awful lot of research on this which suggests that your emotional learning and your cognitive learning are tied together, there's other sorts of questions. So what I would say to my students, and I would say it in the very first week of class, I would talk a little bit about my history and talk about how I cannot engage in this material without it having an emotional impact on me. There are moments which sometimes I know about and sometimes strike me just by surprise, that I can be overcome by some of the things that we're talking about. And I say to them, if you are not willing to commit emotionally to the class as well as intellectually, then it's probably not the class for you. And this is the first week of class, so they can drop and shop for a different class. But they have to know up front what is expected of them and why that's expected. And then as I go through the course, through the various sort of assignments that I have, they are as often intended to help them think about what it is like to be an actual individual in those circumstances as opposed to just reading the history of them. But that kind of preparation and that kind of indication to students that this is a course that demands more than that you be good students. It demands that you commit yourselves in a way. And it is my sense of sort of ethical teaching that I have to tell them that's because I commit in a different way to this than a course that I may teach on the Mexican Revolution, which I don't have the same investment in.
So do you use this technique in other courses that may not be as emotionally laden?
I do, but I generally use it in courses that do have a very difficult content in them. So I teach a lot about the border. I teach a lot about the drug violence in Juarez and in that areas. I actually oversaw a program that brought students to Juarez for a semester, and so those, I will use it in those courses as well. Other courses I will use art, but not necessarily in the same way. I use them in the sense of high road transfer. So for me, many of these things are not specifically designed just for difficult or traumatic discussions. The notion of observation, the notion of deep readings that really are transferable, the notion of evidence and how that then is brought back into the classroom. All of those things are present in all classes. And in virtually all of my classes, I will bring students into the museum for that kind of purpose, because it's something that you can grab onto as, remember when we were in the museum and did this, and they get that. The work that Liliana and I did in sort of canvassing students and faculty after their visits indicated the way in which these kinds of lessons stayed with them. So yeah.
Thank you. In your presentation, you flashed the picture of the Vietnamese prisoner being shot quite often. And I was wondering, could you explain why, and also your experience with your students over time as to how they reacted to that picture?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I've never used that picture with my students. My slide set here was specifically designed to make use of the Yale galleries. And we don't have Eddie Adams at Oberlin, and so I've never taught with that before. It was a challenge when invited to try to figure out exactly what images I wanted to use and why. I did decide on, particularly for the teaching demonstration yesterday, on many images coming out of the Vietnam War, particularly by Larry Burroughs and by Eddie Adams as well. But to answer your question more specifically in terms of here, the interesting fact about that is, of course, it is a very iconic image coming out of the war, two, a very difficult image because you will probably imagine that this is the caption will tell you, but it is a moment of execution. What it allows, if you contextualize around it, which is really what has to happen. I mean, I would never flash an image and say, here's a picture from the war, and then let's go on to something else without demanding the context. And so the context demands, so what was Eddie Adams doing at the time? And we have lots of information from him about walking down the street, somebody saying that something was going on in the next street, him following over there, and this man with the pistol walks up to the prisoner, and Adams thinks with everyone else that he is just going to frighten him, but he raises the camera and takes the shot right as the prisoner is executed. It turns out that the Vietnamese general in the picture, General Luan, then came up to Eddie Adams afterwards and said simply, he's killed many of my men and your men, and he walked away. Years later, Eddie Adams presented testimony that would help General Luan get residency in the United States, and they maintained a conversation for many years after that time. So the issue that it opens up is that an image can be triggering in the sense that it could open so many questions, and what you're looking for is a way to allow an image to open a conversation as opposed to close it. If you never view the image, you never open the conversation. By viewing the image, again, I must admit, with proper context on all sides of it, then you could have that conversation about what was this about? What was this moment about? How do you understand it? Can you imagine yourself in a similar context, et cetera, et cetera? So that's essentially why I chose it as the key image for this.
Thank you. My question is related to just like the idea of the museum being used as this gateway to having these conversations, and when the museum itself can seem like a intimidating place to people that they might not have, they might not feel comfortable in, they might not feel like it's meant for them, where collections are historically like Western-centric, male painting. There's like structural, problems already within the institution. So how, when you're dealing with like a public coming into this place to have these conversations, how do you deal with the fact that the museum itself is already kind of a place of contention and perhaps triggering or feeling unwelcomed, or of various, kind of emotions that might take place there?
So you're talking about how do you deal with that when you are in the museum as a docent or curator, as opposed to preparing for the visit itself?
I'm a gallery teacher here, so like who we're teaching is pretty much people in K through 12 in New Haven. So how, as like a gallery teacher, can this method be used when students are coming to a museum feeling perhaps like it might not be meant for them?
Right. So I think there's a number of ways, and this is not particularly my field, so I think others have probably thought about it much more than I have. Let me suggest a couple ways, and ways that I've seen worked, and I was talking with some other folks here in the museum about this earlier. The The Whitechapel Gallery in London, for me, has always been a really interesting gallery. It's in the east end of London, the east side. Its particular remit is to serve its community. It was founded early in the 1900s, and it has maintained an ability to look at contemporary art from the time in a very edgy fashion. So it was the first place where Frida Kahlo, for example, was exhibited in Europe. A lot of Picasso's Guernica was sort of housed there for a certain period of time. The community around the Whitechapel was fundamentally formed by Huguenots fleeing from Europe, and then by Jewish immigrants at the turn of the century. It became almost totally Jewish, and then by Muslims from Bangladesh, Sylheti speakers from Bangladesh, who form 95% of the community now. And yet they put on exhibits of contemporary art that are abstract and hard and difficult. And so their question is, how do they make their viewers, who they will try to bring in from the community, understand what's going on? One of the things they do is they make sure their docents are from the community itself and not from outside. The second thing is that they make the gallery seem as comfortable as possible, and this was what we were discussing before. You walk into the Whitechapel, and there are kids sitting on the ground looking at paintings, right? And so they can feel like this is a space. You work with the museum guards to make sure that they don't say, you can't do that, you can't sit there. At the same time, you obviously respect some museum traditions. You don't bring in magic markers, and you don't throw things, and et cetera. So you make them feel. And so you walk through the Whitechapel, and you'll see one of the docents from the community talking to the kids, and the kids saying, hey, man, I've never seen that before. And there's a kind of interaction there that is really important. So that's one whole aspect. The second whole aspect, and this would totally depend on the age of the visitors that you're bringing in. You can talk about the museum, but often you're talking about the objects that you're looking at. And hopefully they're not a lot of objects. I mean, not the whole museum, but 5 or 3. Those are their objects. That is their viewing. That's what they own. And that doesn't have to conform to the structural aspects that built the museum. They are capable of owning that vision and discussing that vision with those around them. So to the extent that the visit to the museum is not about a curator saying, let me tell you about Rembrandt, but rather about what do you see here, and how do you see yourself in this or not in this, represented or not represented, what is this about to you, then at least you can make that visit theirs, as opposed to the intention of the museum, which has always been about something else.
Hi. It was so helpful to hear about the ways you use the museum to open up conversations and to have students be reflective about their own position to the subject. I'm wondering how you extend that high road transfer back to the classroom so that when you re-engage with a text that could be somewhat traumatic, or you mentioned using firsthand accounts, how do you prepare students and carry that experience back to the classroom?
Yeah. The question of transfer that you talk about is kind of the what you are looking for. I mean, the key thing that what we want is the ability to transfer knowledge from one domain to another. Some of the problems of higher education, I would argue, is present in the fact that we are preparing students to be students. And they're going to stop being students. We are helping them be good at what they are good at, and not at being able to transfer the kinds of concepts that they learn from one area into another area. And that's, to me, why this issue of using the museum as a point of transfer, high road transfer, becomes so important. It's because it's something we could do. So there's different ways to think about this. They're very direct ways. I mean, often in my position as directing the Teaching and Learning Center and working with Liliana in the museum, part of what we try to do with faculty as they come back to their classrooms is either I would sit in on their classes and see what the discussions were like, but often try to elicit in them when they have writing assignments, when they have different kinds of assignments, to foreground the role of the visual or the museum visit within their comments as well, so to make that quite present. But what I found myself doing in my own class is when issues became very difficult, always coming back to this point of where are you? Where are you literally sitting, standing in relationship to the material that you have? Quite often they would represent this because I would give them a wide variety of ways in which they could respond, including by visual ways, artistic ways. They would respond in that sort of way, and I could see themselves sort of sitting in a room looking at what was going on. But most often, because their experience was embodied, I could say, imagine where you felt yourself at that time and where are you now. So that's one way of doing it.
We have time for one more question.
So in the class that you ran yesterday, which was lovely, you talked a little bit about the position of the photographer. And I wonder if just in our last few minutes you would say a little bit more about, the positionality of the photographer, the ethics of that person as a viewer.
Right. So this is, again, my entry into this. When I began to think more deeply about it, I realized that photography and conflict photography in particular was one way into thinking about this. There is a huge field that will study war photography and war journalism in terms of that kind of placement. I was very intrigued by Susan Meiselas in particular. She's actually an old friend, and we would talk a lot. And the way that she talked about different lenses that she would physically put on her camera when in Nicaragua and then in El Salvador helped me think about this as well. So the ethics of the photographer always as well has to do with placement. She felt, for example, that she has, in her latest book, there's an image of a plane flying over a city in Nicaragua during the revolution against Somoza in 1979. And the plane is very present. And it was at that moment that was right after she had received a 400 millimeter lens from her agency, from Magnum, who thought that she was way too close to her subjects. And she felt it was unethical to use it. She never used the 400 millimeter after that because it was presenting a picture as if she were close and she wasn't. And she didn't like that at all. And so she discarded it at that time. The dangers that poses, the dangers that photographers will go through, because if you're going to photograph the way that Larry Burroughs photographs, you can end up, as he did, got killed in the process. And war journalism, photographers and journalists have the highest mortality rate within these conflicts of any other profession, in a certain sense, per number that they are. But the ethics of that is responsibly and ethically reporting where your standpoint is. And so the translation of that in terms of teaching and learning is ethically you need to know, you need to question, you need to reflect on where it is that you're standing and what informs that standpoint. And I think that sort of goes back to your question about the diversity of students that you're bringing into it. Because if you can imagine that you are viewing from a particular perspective then you have to also imagine that students in your class can be viewing this from a different perspective. And that perspective is an honest one, but it also has to be brought out into the open so it can be discussed. Again, the sort of bottom line is that if you never look at the Eddie Adams photograph because it's too problematic, then you can't open any of this up and you can't discuss it.
Let me conclude our time together with 3 really important thank yous. Number 1, thanks to all of you for coming today and for engaging in this really outstanding conversation. Number 2, thank you to Liliana and her amazing colleagues for organizing this several days of wonderful events. And Steve, thank you so much for being here and for enriching our week. We appreciate it.
Thank you.